Billionaire father saw his disabled son lead his first dance, thanks to a black waitress. He reached out his hand, not to beg, not to ask, but to dance. In a room full of silence and judgment, a young black waitress did something no one expected. Oh, she said yes. And in that moment, everything changed. A billionaire watched his world crack. A boy took his first real step. And a woman no one saw became the force no one could ignore. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Stay with us. Black waitress lets disabled boy lead a dance in public. The hum of wealth filled the air at Kingsley's, the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan. Glass chandeliers dripped light like diamonds, every silver fork placed just so, every whispered conversation threaded with power. The kind of place where black hands poured the wine but were never raised in a toast, where people like Diana Johnson were meant to blend into the white linens and marble. She had worked here for 5 years, never late, never loud, never seen, and tonight she moved through the dining room like air, present, necessary, invisible. Then the piano started. A soft, rolling melody floated from the corner, curling like smoke between tables. Conversations quieted, as they often did when the pianist began. But this time, the silence grew dense, because something happened that no one expected. Lucas Montgomery, just 10 years old with legs wrapped in cold metal braces, stood from his chair. He wobbled, his hand trembled, and then reaching past the wine glasses, past the veal medallions and business deals, he extended his hand to Diana. "Miss," he said softly, "may I dance with you?" Time stopped. The clatter of cutlery froze mid-air. Every eye in the room turned to them, a collective breath caught in throats dressed in custom suits. "Sir, control your son," barked the manager, his voice slicing through the quiet. "This is not a dance hall, and our employees are not here to entertain children." Diana stood still, not from fear, from calculation. She looked at the boy, then at the man sitting 2 seats away, Richard Montgomery, billionaire. Real estate mogul, owner of Montgomery Investments. A man who had built skyscrapers across the globe but hadn't taken his son to dinner since the accident 2 years ago. "Lucas, sit down," Richard said, voice low and firm, jaw clenched, but Lucas didn't move. His hand was still up, waiting to be seen. Diana didn't look at the manager again. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply unknotted her apron, folded it slowly, placed it on her tray with reverence, and turned to Lucas. "I can't dance in an apron," she said gently and smiled. Gasps whispered like wind across the room. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Diana met his gaze. Her eyes didn't flinch. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." A hush swept the room. Lucas stepped forward. The sound of metal scraping against tile echoed like thunder. He dragged one leg, then the other. His steps were clumsy, hesitant, but Diana didn't take over. She didn't guide him. She didn't fix him. She followed. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband. "She'll be fired by tomorrow," she whispered. At a nearby table, a waiter froze mid-pour. Richard watched, stiff, silent. The room blurred as a memory seized him, his late wife, Elizabeth, laughing in the living room, spinning Lucas in her arms before the accident. "It's not about perfection," she had whispered back then. "It's about connection." That memory cracked something, because what Diana was doing was not polished, not proper, not part of the service, but it was honest. Lucas was leading. For the first time since the accident, he was not being pushed or pulled, not being managed. He was being trusted, 3 small steps, each one slow, painful, brave. Diana never broke rhythm. She adjusted her own pace to match his. Her eyes on him, her body bowed to his will. Then she turned and walked him back to the table, her posture proud, her presence undeniable. Thank you for asking me, she said to Lucas, her voice formal, adult. It was an honor. She turned to leave. Wait, Richard said. It came out hoarse, raw. She stopped. What's your full name? Diana Johnson, sir. He nodded slowly, as if memorizing it. Diana Johnson, he repeated. From inside his jacket, he pulled a card. My office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Diana took the card. Her hand shook, but her face did not. From across the room, Lucas called out, Dad, why did you do that? The words hit the air like a bell, ringing, accusing, honest. And for the first time, Richard saw his son, not just the broken legs or the hospital bills, but the full person. The human being with a voice, with a need to be more than what had happened to him. Dinner continued in silence after that. But the real conversation had already begun. And it started with the only hand in the room brave enough to reach across a line no one else dared cross. A black woman's hand, taking the lead by letting go. Black waitress refuses billionaire's job offer with one sentence. The morning sun bounced off the glass facade of Montgomery Tower like it belonged to no one else. It was a building built to impress, to intimidate, to remind everyone who owned the sky in this city. Diana Johnson stood in its shadow, wearing the best outfit she owned. A navy blue skirt and a white blouse, ironed the night before with the same care one might give to armor. She stepped inside the lobby, clutching her worn purse. The floor gleamed, the walls shimmered, but none of it looked warm. Everything about this place was cold, calculated, expensive. The receptionist glanced up. Her eyes moved over Diana like a scanner, pausing at her braids, her dark skin, the purse that didn't match her shoes. Diana Johnson to see Mr. Montgomery, she said, steady. The woman tapped a few keys, spoke into a headset, then said without a smile, 18th floor. Someone will meet you. In the elevator, Diana breathed deeply, grounding herself. Not in fear, but in memory. She had stood in more threatening places than this. Courtrooms, welfare lines, emergency rooms at 2 a.m. This, she reminded herself, was just another room full of people who thought they were better. On the 18th floor, a tall woman in a black suit and sharp heels greeted her. Miss Johnson, I'm Miss Winters, Mr. Montgomery is finishing a call. Follow me. The hallway smelled of money, the kind that doesn't fold, only transfers. As they walked past mirrored walls and glass offices, heads turned. Diana felt their stares. A black woman in a blouse that didn't carry a brand name. She walked anyway, each step quiet but certain. Winters broke the silence. He had you fired, didn't he? Diana turned slightly. Excuse me. It happens, a client complains. People like you lose their jobs. People like me? Diana's voice stayed calm, but her eyes narrowed. Winters adjusted her glasses. Employees who don't know their place. Diana smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. And where exactly would that be? Before Winters could answer, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, then motioned. He'll see you now. The office was massive, lined with windows that looked out over a city that Richard Montgomery owned more than a slice of. He stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. Miss Johnson, he said without turning, thank you for coming. She nodded. You invited me. He motioned to a chair. Please. The silence that followed was intentional. Diana recognized it. She had heard it before in interviews where people waited for her to explain away her name, her skin, her education. But she said nothing. Let the silence grow. Finally, he spoke. Do you have a background? In what sense? Education. She didn't flinch. Bachelor's in Child Development. NYU, almost completed a master's in special education. Almost. I left to care for my sister. Family came first. He moved to a table, picked up a file. I had someone look into you. You co-founded something called Freedom Steps. Diana nodded. Dance therapy for kids with disabilities. We've helped dozens. Would have helped hundreds if we hadn't lost funding. You didn't come here to ask for money. No, I came because you asked me to. He closed the file. I want to hire you. Her eyebrows lifted, but she didn't speak. Not as a waitress, he continued. As a therapeutic companion for Lucas. She kept her posture still, eyes clear. I've got top specialists, physical therapists, psychologists, the best in the country, but what you did last night. It reached him. It was just a dance. It was more than that. It was the first time I've seen him smile in 2 years. His voice cracked slightly, barely. I don't need someone to dance with my son. I need someone who can do what you did, follow his lead. Diana stood slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. No. He blinked. I can pay you 5 times what you make now. I'm not for sale. His jaw tightened. You're turning down an offer that could solve your financial problems. I'm turning down a mindset, she replied. Because you saw my color and my clothes before you saw my qualifications. And now you want to fix your son with a transaction. He stepped closer, frustration rising. You think this is about control? No, she said, her voice still warm but unwavering. It's about dignity. And your son deserves more than someone pretending to care, because they're being paid to. She pulled something from her purse. A simple card printed at home, the edges slightly worn. She placed it on the desk. Freedom Steps. Tuesdays and Thursdays. 4 o'clock, first class is free. She turned to leave. Lucas doesn't need another expert, she said without looking back. He needs space and someone willing to follow. And with that, Diana Johnson walked out of the office that ruled the skyline. Not because she wasn't offered enough, but because she already knew her worth. Disabled boy takes his first step and teaches his father to follow. The Bentley didn't belong on that block. Its glossy black paint reflected the graffiti-tagged walls of the South Bronx like oil on water. It stood out too much, like wealth trying to hide in a working-class church parking lot. Inside, Richard Montgomery sat still behind the wheel, hands tight around the leather steering. His eyes flicked toward the back seat where Lucas stared nervously out the window. You sure you want to do this? Richard asked, voice low. Lucas nodded. They said I could dance here. Richard didn't respond. He looked at the old warehouse building in front of them. It had no sign, no valet, just a green door and a handwritten flyer taped to it. Freedom Steps, every Tuesday and Thursday, 4 p.m. first class free. He almost backed out, but then Lucas opened the door before he could speak. Outside, Diana stood near the entrance, tying her shoe. She looked up and offered a simple smile, not smug, not surprised, just ready. Lucas shuffled forward, adjusting the straps on his leg braces. Richard hesitated. Then slowly he stepped out. Inside, the building was alive, not polished, not perfect, but vibrant. The walls were painted in bold colors, some uneven, clearly touched by children's hands. Posters read your rhythm, your rules, and every move counts. The floor creaked beneath their steps, but laughter echoed from the back room. Lucas froze at the doorway to the main space. Children moved freely, some in wheelchairs spinning to the beat, others with crutches, prosthetic limbs, or uncertain balance, finding their own rhythm. No one corrected them. No one said not like that. Diana approached and knelt beside Lucas. You ready? She asked gently. He looked up at her, then over his shoulder at his father. I'll be right here, Richard said, trying to sound sure. Lucas nodded. Diana led him into the group. Richard stood alone at the edge, arms folded, eyes scanning the room like a man inspecting the structure of a building he didn't trust. Next to him, a woman sat with quiet authority. She was older, with silver braids tucked neatly into a wrap and eyes sharp as glass. She used a carved wooden cane, not for decoration, but command. "You're Richard Montgomery," she said without looking at him. He turned slightly. "Do I know you? You rejected my research proposal 3 times." She finally looked at him. Dr. Elaine Mercer, neuroscientist, retired from Harvard. He blinked. "I didn't expect to see you here. I help oversee this program. You're running a dance class." She smiled. "That's what you think this is." Diana returned, stepping between them with the ease of someone used to holding 2 worlds apart. "Freedom Steps is a pilot rehabilitation program," she explained, "based on the theory of movement autonomy and neuroplasticity." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You mean kids dancing helps their brains heal?" Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Movement creates new neural pathways, especially when the movement is chosen, not imposed." Diana added, "It's not therapy the way you know it, it's freedom, that's the point." He looked through the window. Lucas had joined a group now. A girl in a wheelchair spun beside him. A boy with a prosthetic tapped the beat with his foot. Lucas was smiling. "I've had every specialist work with him," Richard muttered. "The best. No one gets him to smile like that." Diana didn't respond. She didn't need to. He looked back at her. "You co-authored that proposal?" he asked. Elaine answered for her. She did, but she had to drop out of her master's to care for her sister. Still, her theoretical model is years ahead of what's published. "You knew who I was at the restaurant." Diana met his gaze. "Yes, from the moment you walked in." "You set that up." "No," she said calmly. Lucas stood up. "I just chose to follow." Across the room, Lucas giggled as he tried a new step, missing the beat but catching joy in the process. Richard stared, jaw clenched, not in anger, but in the raw confusion of a man watching his own story being rewritten. He had come expecting to judge a dance class, but instead the building around him began to feel like something else entirely. A sanctuary, one that hadn't been built for him, but one that might be able to save him too. He just had to let go. Billionaire accuses black teacher of using his son for publicity. The click of camera shutters was sharp and sudden, cutting through the soft rhythm of music like glass breaking on tile. Richard's head turned fast. Across the room, 3 reporters had slipped in, cameras in hand, notebooks ready, their eyes already locked on Lucas, who was mid-step with another child. No one had told him the press would be here. No one had asked. He stormed across the studio toward Diana. "What is this?" he hissed under his breath. She turned to him calmly, her expression unreadable. "You invited reporters." "They were invited to observe our research methods," she said. "The article came out this morning. First results published, that's all." "You used my son," Richard snapped. "This whole thing, was this just a PR stunt?" Diana's voice remained steady. "No. This was the first time you let him enter a space he didn't have to earn." He didn't answer. "Come with me," she said. She led him through a narrow hallway off the main studio. The noise faded behind them until they stood inside a smaller room with pale yellow walls. It smelled faintly of paint and glue, like childhood, like effort. Photos covered the walls, dozens of children, each caught mid-laughter, mid-motion. Below each photo were handwritten notes. Names, conditions, goals, milestones. Richard walked slowly, reading. Maya, age 7, first time standing for 8 seconds. Elia's age 9, 4 steps without support. Each image told a story that was once dismissed as impossible. Then he stopped. There was one frame that held no photo, just an empty white background. Beneath it, a note in black marker. This space is for the child who still hasn't been given the chance. Richard stared at it for a long time. Diana spoke softly behind him. You don't see your son, you see a problem you need to fix. He turned to her, anger barely contained. I've spent millions on his recovery. I've hired the best. And none of them ever let him lead, she said. They all held his hand so tightly he forgot he had his own rhythm. Richard's voice dropped low. I was protecting him. You were protecting yourself, she said without malice. From seeing him fall, from seeing him fail, but he can't grow if you don't let him move. He didn't speak. Lucas doesn't need permission to dance, she continued. He needs a place where he doesn't have to apologize for how he moves through the world. Richard stepped closer to the empty frame. You think this is about me, he said quietly. No, Diana replied. It's about all the children that people like you pass by, because their pace doesn't match the schedule of success. She walked over and gently placed a hand on the table. I didn't borrow your son, she said. I simply made space for him to choose his own step. Behind them, Lucas's laugh echoed faintly down the hallway, and for the first time, Richard realized. He hadn't heard that sound in years. Black Boy removes his brace and takes a step that silences a room. The music had stopped. Someone had cut the speaker mid-track, but no one noticed exactly when. All attention had shifted to the center of the room where Lucas stood surrounded by a loose circle of children. His breath was shallow. His hands were clenched at his sides. One leg still held its brace, the other was bare, just a sock and skin, trembling with the pressure of what he was about to do. The room fell into complete silence. Even the camera shutters paused. Diana stood a few steps away, watching with the stillness of someone who knew this was sacred ground. She didn't move, she didn't rush in. She let him have the space. Lucas took a deep breath. Then slowly he lifted his foot. The first shift forward was barely more than a wobble. His arms flailed slightly, trying to catch balance. His jaw clenched. Then his foot came down, one step. The room gasped like it had been holding its breath for hours. Lucas looked up, eyes wide in disbelief. The children around him started clapping, unsure if they should cheer or stay silent. One girl wiped her eyes without knowing why. Richard Montgomery was standing near the door. His hands had fallen to his sides. His tie loosened. His eyes welled with something rare and unfamiliar. Diana turned toward him but said nothing. Then the cameras clicked again, fast this time. Reporters rushed in with questions, recorders pointed, notepads open. Everyone moved toward Richard, sensing this was the moment. He stepped forward. All eyes turned to him. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Montgomery, care to comment on your presence here today? Is it true your foundation previously declined to fund this program? Richard glanced back at his son. Lucas was now laughing, surrounded by children who looked at him not with pity but admiration. He turned to the reporters. You know what's hard, he said, voice rough but steady. What's hard for people like me? Admitting when we're wrong. The room fell quiet again. He continued. I've spent a fortune on experts, on facilities, on control, but none of it gave my son what he just gave himself. That step, that was his. He paused, letting the silence settle. The Montgomery Foundation is committing to fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 5 years, he announced. And we're going to build a permanent center designed for these children and this method. Cameras flashed again. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but then he raised a hand. One condition, he added. Miss Johnson retains full authority, no corporate board, no interference. She leads this. Diana blinked. For a second, the entire room dissolved, and it was just her and Richard. She didn't speak, but her nod was slow, sure, and full of something far deeper than victory. Across the room, Lucas reached out his hand again, this time not for help, but to lead another child in a dance. And the room, once filled with doubt and scrutiny, began to move again, to his rhythm. When a leader learns to step back and let others rise. The new Freedom Steps Center stood like a quiet revolution at the corner of a worn-out block. The glass wasn't flawless, the paint didn't gleam, but every inch of the space felt alive. Not because of the design, but because of who helped design it. Children had chosen the wall colors. Lucas insisted on sunset orange for the east wing. Others asked for wide doorways, mirrors placed lower, and no sharp corners. This place wasn't built for charity. It was built for them, by them. In the center's main hall, music played softly, not for performance, for exploration. Lucas moved across the polished wooden floor with a grace that surprised even himself. He wore no braces now, just socks. One foot slightly heavier than the other, but his rhythm was steady, confident. Diana watched from the side, arms folded, a warm smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Richard entered through the rear doors, carrying a file stuffed with notes, post-it flags sticking out like feathers. His shirt sleeves were rolled, tie gone, hair grayer than before. He didn't belong to boardrooms these days. He belonged here among blueprints of movement and recovery. "You're early," Diana said as he sat beside her. "I didn't want to miss today. Lucas asked me to watch." "He doesn't ask unless it matters." Richard nodded, pulling out a thick research article. "I've been studying neural repatterning and proprioceptive feedback." Diana raised an eyebrow. "I see you've been doing your homework." He smiled without looking up. "He said he wants to teach other kids how to move like he does. He asked if we could open a second program, somewhere in Chicago." "Oh, wait." He looked at her finally. "I know I'm just a funder, but I'd like to keep learning." She paused, then asked quietly, "Why?" He closed the file slowly. "Because when I walk into a room now, I don't want to be the one who knows best. I want to be the one who listens best." Diana's gaze softened. "That's not what most men with your background say." He exhaled. "I used to think fixing something meant throwing money at it. You taught me that healing doesn't come from control. It comes from being present and quiet." She looked out toward the floor where Lucas was showing a younger boy how to shift weight before taking a step. He wasn't instructing. He was sharing, the way Diana had once shared with him. "Lucas told me he wants the second brace off," Richard said. Diana turned back to him. "Did his therapist approve?" She said it was too soon. I told him that. He said, "I'll decide when I'm ready." Diana smiled, eyes glistening. "And what did you say?" "I said okay." There was a long silence between them. "Do you remember the day you said I never really apologized?" Richard asked. She didn't answer right away. "Yes." "I still haven't said it, not out loud." She looked at him. "But you've shown it in every meeting, every class you sat in the back of, every parent you listened to." He lowered his voice. "I am sorry for not seeing you, for not seeing Lucas, for thinking I had to lead everything in order to be valuable." Diana looked back at Lucas. "He doesn't need anyone to lead him anymore." Richard followed her gaze, pride blooming behind his eyes. "No. He just needs us to step back and be there if he falls." And in that room built by courage, forgiveness, and the small victories of movement, a boy once trapped by metal now danced freely. And the man who once tried to fix the world with power had learned something deeper, to let go and walk behind. True strength isn't leading, it's having the courage to follow. The sky was soft with late afternoon light, casting gold across the sidewalk outside the new Freedom Steps Center. Paper lanterns swayed in the breeze. Folding chairs lined the open courtyard, filled with families, volunteers, and a few reporters with cameras ready and notebooks open. Inside, the new dance hall smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Mirrors stretched along the walls, but no one was looking at their reflection. All eyes were on the center of the room. Lucas stood at the front of a small group, 4 children, each with a different story stitched into their stride. A girl with a prosthetic leg, a boy who walked with a cane, a girl in a motorized wheelchair with silver ribbons tied to the wheels. And Lucas, now brace-free, his posture tall, his eyes steady. The music began, a quiet beat. Nothing dramatic, just enough for them to catch it, feel it, follow it. Lucas raised his arms. The others mirrored him, and together they moved. It wasn't polished, it wasn't synchronized, it was beautiful because every step was theirs. Diana stood off to the side, wearing a navy dress that caught the light at just the right angles. Her hair framed her face softly. Her arms were folded, but her body leaned forward, her whole presence focused on them, on Lucas. Richard stood beside her. No tie, no title. Just a man watching his son lead in a way no inheritance ever could have prepared him for. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Their eyes met briefly. Nothing needed to be said. When the music ended, the room erupted in applause, not the polite kind. The kind that comes from a place deeper than admiration, from recognition, from reverence. Lucas bowed. Reporters surged forward. Flashbulbs popped. One of them, holding a mic, turned to Richard. "Mr. Montgomery, can I ask, what's the biggest lesson you've learned from all of this?" He looked at her, then at the kids, then at Diana. Then he stepped forward and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "The biggest lesson?" he repeated. He let the words settle in the air before continuing. "It's that being powerful doesn't mean you always lead. Sometimes, real strength means having the humility to follow." The reporter tilted her head. "To follow who exactly?" Richard turned toward Lucas, who was now helping the girl in the wheelchair guide herself off the stage. "To follow the ones who show you a better way, even if they're half your size, even if they can't walk as far, because sometimes they're walking straighter than you ever did." A hush fell over the crowd. No one clapped, not yet. It was too honest. Too raw. Then Diana leaned over, whispered just loud enough for Richard to hear. "Looks like you finally learned how to move." He smiled. "No, I finally learned when not to." And in that moment, under the setting sun, surrounded by joy, sweat, and the music of progress, the billionaire didn't feel like a man who had built an empire. He felt like a man who had finally arrived at the right place. By choosing to follow. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't leading, it's stepping back so someone else can rise. Lucas didn't just learn to walk, he taught others how to believe again. Diana didn't just build a center, she rebuilt dignity brick by brick. And Richard, he didn't lose control, he finally found what mattered most. This story reminds us that true strength isn't measured by money, fame, or power. It's measured by how we show up for others, especially when no one's watching. If this story moved you even just a little, take a second to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear what you took away from this journey, and this is only the beginning. In our next videos, we'll continue shining a light on the untold stories of Black resilience. The battles fought in silence, the triumphs the world overlooked, and the everyday courage that will leave you stunned, inspired, and deeply moved. Because these aren't just stories, they're real voices, real lives, real power. We'll see you there.